Just like I say to my middle schoolers, thank you all for being so flexible with me. I appreciate it. Well, yeah, so the reason we're here, growing cannabis at home. Now, today is Indigenous Persons Day here in Minnesota. In fact, the first time that it's been Indigenous Persons Day here in the state. So we did want to take a minute to sort of acknowledge that we are on Dakota land. We're on land that historically, but also currently, has people of Dakota heritage residing on it, along with many other Native nations that help to make Minnesota what it is. So we don't want to lose that. Cannabis as a plant, well, it doesn't have native roots here in Minnesota. It was really brought to the state only in the 1850s. Native cultures have found a way to adapt to it, and we really want to highlight that and really emphasize that. So Minnesota Cannabis College as an organization, we're committed to trying to create an equitable cannabis industry. That doesn't just mean having businesses throughout the state. It does mean that. It doesn't just mean having businesses that do transportation and also retail sales, but it means having businesses that really represent the industry that we have as users, and that includes our native populations here in the state. So before we jump in, we wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that. This is a little bit about what we'll be doing today. I always got to start a class with introductions, otherwise how do you know who I am? And then we're going to really jump into cannabis laws. Now we're just going to talk about that very briefly because it's been legal here in the state for a couple months now. So we're just going to touch on what's important for us as growers. Then we're going to do an intro to cannabis. What is this plant? You might have been a user of it for many years, but if you're not a grower of it, what does the plant actually look like? How do you grow it? We'll be talking about that. We're going to talk to two really important life cycles, or life stages of the life cycle, the vegetative stage and that flowering stage. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about drying. Sort of the entire process of growing cannabis is what we'll be working through today over the next hour. So let's go ahead and jump in. But first, let's thank our sponsors. No, I'm just kidding. Let's thank our partners. We really have some awesome people that help to make these events possible. We got the Canna Lounge out there. We've got some people that will be trying those Storks and Pickle products later. And then thanks to Steve from Canna Connect. So, all right. So I've been gabbering for a minute, but I haven't actually introduced myself. My name is Tanner. I've been working with the Minnesota Cannabis College for about 3 years now, and I'm really excited to be able to have you all here. I've worked previously in the industry working on that growing and processing side, but my main focus is really on that home grow side. I really like connecting people with the resources that they need to be able to start growing their own plants. So I'd love to hear a little bit about who we have here, and I'm going to do it in just sort of one question. So I'd love for you to take out like a smartphone of some sort. You can scan this QR code, or you can go to this website, and you will see a question that's going to ask you, what is your previous experience growing cannabis? And it's super okay if the answer is. And then I also like to begin all of my grow classes with this quote. So if you've been in my online class, you know this quote already. If you've read the Cannabis Growers Manual, you probably know this as well. And it says, although cannabis may not be habit forming, growing it is. And I personally can attest to that 100%. I say that cannabis is not really a gateway drug, but it is that gateway drug to agriculture. The idea of you can just take seeds and grow things. I was not a green-thumbed individual growing up. My parents were not gardeners. But it's sort of through cannabis that I found this love for being able to take seeds, give it some care, a lot of water, and some other nutrients that we'll talk about in a little bit, and getting it to a finished product. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. But just wanted to throw that caveat in. Soon you'll have many tents and many lights, and your fiance will be getting mad at you. Okay, so cannabis laws. So we've got a lot around cannabis that's legal here in Minnesota as of August 1st. We don't have stores outside of our native nations that are selling adult use cannabis that's smokable, but there are some things that you can do. You can possess cannabis, you can gift cannabis, and sort of the whole reason that we're all here, you can grow that cannabis at home. Now there's specific requirements around how much cannabis you can possess, and we'll touch on that in a minute, but I really want to focus on the laws around growing cannabis. Because while it is important to know you can't have more than 2 ounces in public, it is important to know you can't have more than 2 pounds in your own home, we're here to talk about the growing side. So you can have up to 8 plants total per residence. And I want to clarify, this is per residence, not per resident. There are 2 people that live in my apartment. Still 8 plant max for that individual unit. This applies to that entire residence. So if you have an apartment you rent with a friend, that is the same residence unless it's a separate legal address. You can have 4 of those plants flowering at any given time, and we'll talk about what that means in a couple of minutes. Your plants need to be in an enclosed locked space, and this does apply to both those indoors and outdoor plants. So we can grow outdoors in Minnesota, but it does still need to be in a place that's locked and not available to the public. And it also can't be in public view. So if someone's standing on the street and they can see your plant, first off, nice work. It means you grew a really great plant. But it means that, unfortunately, that plant is now no longer legally compliant. You got to make sure that that plant is not visible, not reachable to people in the general public. If your neighbors can see it, according to North Star Law Group, a group that we chatted with a bit earlier, that would be allowed. That's not public land, but we really encourage you to still utilize caution. You know, neighbors are cool, but it would sure suck if someone in the middle of the night came and took your plants. So definitely, you know, we're still at a time when cannabis is scarce. So make sure you're being safe with your cannabis as you're growing it. Let's keep moving through here as sort of an intro to cannabis. So we know the laws, we can have up to 8 plants. We're going to be talking about some situations tonight where you might be growing more than 8 plants. That is not legal guidance. That is just talking about how to grow this plant generally. You might be in a state where you can grow more than 8 plants of some sort. You might get a commercial license. You might be allowed to do that. So we're going to talk about the plant generally, but make sure you're keeping this in mind. You don't want to go astray of the law. It's legal. Let's keep it legal. Yeah. I stole that from the States. So, all right, intro to cannabis. So what is this plant actually? Sort of the whole reason we're here. I'm a big fan of quick facts, so sort of like what are like the main things you need to know. And these are some of those 4 main things that'll help you really to understand cannabis and why we grow it the way that we do. First off, cannabis is a super old domesticated plant. It's one of the earliest that we have people domesticated, and it goes back 12,000 years is our estimation. Now, cannabis was used for medicinal purposes, it was used for food, it was used for recreation, spiritual purposes. Cannabis has been used across a variety of different cultures for a variety of different reasons. Cannabis is also an annual plant, meaning that in one growing season, it goes through its entire life cycle. So you're not going to be growing a plant outdoors season after season after season. Are there ways to keep a plant alive for long periods of time? Absolutely. Is it completing its life cycle in just that one growing season? Yeah, it still is. Most cannabis is something that's known as photosensitive, meaning that it's moving through its life cycle based upon how much light that it's receiving. And we're going to talk about more of that in a couple of minutes. And then finally, the reason that we're here is these guys, these white alien-looking things growing on the plant are what's known as trichomes. They store those cannabinoids, terpenes, and are really important to sort of why we're growing cannabis. These are just some quick facts to help you a little bit better understand cannabis itself, but we've got a lot more to cover, so let's keep moving. I like to think of my friend Sean Weber from Crested River every time I talk about this, because he really likes to emphasize the difference between industrial hemp and then the commercial quote-unquote marijuana that people are buying on the streets. So in terms of like the law, it's marijuana or adult use cannabis if it contains above 0.3% THC by weight, and it's hemp, and this is simplifying in many, many ways, if it's below that 0.3% THC. Now, this distinction is in part man-made. I do want to emphasize that. Cannabis can be hemp under this definition one day, and then marijuana the next day. We don't really control that. That's more of a nature type thing. We can guide the plant. We can breed in certain directions. We can hope. We can wish. But ultimately, the plant is going to keep growing in the way that it wants to. It's always cannabis from start to finish, regardless of how much THC it has. And that's why we use the term cannabis, because whether you're growing for fiber or seed or whatever be it, or flower, it's always going to be cannabis. And then the life cycle, and this is very simplified, but in essence, you have a seed that begins that germination. You have a change in the hormones inside of the plant, and it starts growing. It then starts shifting into that vegetative stage when it's growing that infrastructure. And we're going to talk about all that fun infrastructure in just a little bit. And then finally, you get that flowering. Now, there are, of course, other stages to the life cycle. You have seed production. You also have, other types of things that can happen during growing. But for the most part, as a home grower, this is what you're going to be looking at. You're looking at going from seed to vegetative to flowering. Okay, and then we're gonna talk about the things that you need to grow. And then something important that you need to know about me is I'm just gonna keep talking until someone stops me. So if you have a question, please at any point do not hesitate to raise your hand. I'm all about trying to answer questions as they come up. But with that being said, let's keep going. So there are really 7 main things that you need to start growing at home. Now this is sort of a simplified list in a way, but in essence, as long as you can check the box that you have one of something of this, you're gonna be able to get that plant to the end of its life. Now there are some caveats on how well you might be able to do that we'll talk about, but this is sort of the main things that you need. So the first one that we want to talk about is space. Now of course we have that legal requirement. It needs to be secure, out of public view, but generally speaking you're going to look for a place that's a little bit cooler. Now this varies depending upon where in the state you're growing, what season you're growing in, but generally speaking it's easier to raise the temperature in your tent than it is to lower it. So we recommend finding a place such as a basement. If you have like a second office that's not like in the attic, that's something that could definitely work. If you have a room that spikes in the summer in temperature, we generally recommend against growing there. Well, cannabis is a plant that is grown in hot temperatures. When grown inside of a grow tent, not as big of a fan of those 100+ temperatures, so definitely make sure that you're watching that. And then really the biggest thing that you need to keep in mind is you need to have access to electricity for a grow light, you need to have ventilation, and it should have some sort of temperature control. Now that all goes out the window if you're growing outdoors. Obviously you don't need access to electricity for the most part when you're growing outdoors, but when you're growing inside, those are some of the things that you need to be keeping in mind. Talking a little bit about growing medium, that's essentially what you're growing your plant in. You might have heard of things such as hydroponics before, you might have heard of things such as living soil, but in essence it's all just things that hold that plant in place, allow that root system to grow, and allow you to get that plant to the end of its life. It helps to provide those necessary nutrients, it helps to provide water to your plants, and while there's a wide variety of growing mediums, they all sort of come with their own pros and cons. Now we recommend generally as you're getting started to stick with growing in soil. Soil is just traditionally what plants are grown in. Well, you can definitely do things such as cocoa coir, which we'll talk about in a moment. You can definitely do things such as hydroponics. It's just a little bit more challenging for people as they're getting started growing. So as you're getting started, we really, really recommend sticking with soil. If you're feeling like I want to go and explore hydroponics, definitely do. There are some cool advantages to it, but in terms of getting started, you're so much less likely to throw something off and come back the next day to a dead plant if you have soil than if you're growing hydroponically or in things like cocoa coir, which can be a bit more finicky. Now, a question that I get a lot is, can I just go to the store and buy a bag of potting mix? Yeah, for sure you can. I grow tomatoes in my backyard. I don't buy any special soil for the tomatoes. It's all about just sort of getting that plant to the end. But here in Minnesota, we are limited on how many plants we can have. We're only allowed to have 4. I'm speaking for myself, but I imagine for most growers that if you got to choose between growing, 6 ounces versus 4 ounces, you'd choose that higher amount. This is all about sort of trying to maximize the yield you're able to get from your plants and how to make those nutrients as available as possible. So like, I have a friend, he just tossed a seed in his garden bed in his backyard. Can you do that? For sure. He has a locked backyard, so it's allowed. But is it gonna lead to like that highest quality possible product? Not unless you're putting work into really maintaining that soil. So when you're getting started, if you're just putting dirt into a pot, we recommend one of these 3 things. And really, Dr. Dabbs isn't here. I'd recommend the first 2, and I'll talk about why that is. So this first one is like a really classic blend. We call it the house blend, but that's stealing. This is like the blend that most growers use if they're growing on an industrial scale and looking to just buy like the simplest amount of amendments you can add in. It's potting soil, it's worm castings, it's bat guano. Is it gonna provide that full spectrum of nutrients you need to provide? Not really, but it will provide you a lot of nutrients that you can use early on in your growth stage before you start providing other nutrients. If you're looking for something even simpler, you can go to like Home Depot and buy these 2. You can go to Eco Garden Supply over in St. Paul along with many other grow shops and find these potting mixes. These are really well known in the cannabis industry. I personally use these at home when I'm looking for something just really simple to throw together. We recommend mixing that ocean forest with Happy Frog just because ocean forest has a tendency to be a bit hot in the nutrients it's providing. Mixing it with Happy Frog can help to balance that out. But it's sort of a personal preference at this point. I'd recommend using one of those two. If you're looking to mix your own, do something like this. If you're looking for something a bit simpler, do that. I am going to talk about this one for a minute. Dr. Clement Dabney, if you know him, he really helped us to create this course. And that's what he personally grows in and what he would recommend for people who are getting started and looking to do something that is soil-less. So that does not contain any soil. It's just that cocoa coir and perlite. You're providing a slightly different nutrient schedule to it, which is why we generally recommend going with one of these two. This has no nutrients in it at all. You're providing 100% of those nutrients starting out, which can be a bit more challenging for new beginners, so we recommend sticking with one of those two. Yeah, but it also just puts out way less energy. People generally buy like 3 or 4 of these just to grow one plant. Not a good use of your time. We generally recommend sticking with those LED lights. There's been a lot of advancements in the last couple of decades looking at LED lights when grown indoors. They're really sort of the way to go. Unfortunately, it is like a higher upfront cost. If you're looking to buy like a cheaper LED light, you're going to be looking at least $60 to $70. If you're looking to buy something that's going to get you sort of that output that you're wanting, you're looking at a couple $100. And while that's a really big bummer, that is one of those things you purchase once and then in theory you don't have to buy again. So not ideal to have to spend sort of a large amount of money up front, but it's really going to give you a lot better returns. You can go to Home Depot and buy these today. I would heavily encourage you not to for anything outside of your germination. We're going to give you like a recommended shopping list at the end of this class today that includes a bunch of different stuff on it, and it includes some LED lights that we generally recommend. We're not at all sponsored by AC Infinity, but we do generally point people in that direction just because they have a ton of support that's available to people, and it's sort of that like turnkey solution. Are there other lights you can use? Sure, if you want to buy Spider Farmer, I won't say anything, but we recommend AC Infinity generally. Have an inline fan that's cycling that air through. You're going to have a carbon filter that is pulling that air through it. You can push air through a carbon filter, but it's generally best to suck through it. And then you have exhaust ducting that's pumping that air out. If you want to have some sort of controlled inline filter, you can. But for most home tents, it's not actually required. It allows there to be like an ambient amount of air that's sucked in. And as long as you're having that vacuum, you don't have to worry about scent leaking out. And then oscillating fan, it's so important. Not only is it important for having airflow, it's really important for maintaining temperature and maintaining just proper humidity throughout your plant. Especially as you move into flowering, humidity becomes crazy important, and those fans are going to be really helpful in maintaining that. So those are the types of things that you'd be looking to set up inside of your tent. That's actually my tent at home right now. This is the setup that I use. It works, and we'll talk about what it is in a little bit.
Is that inside or outside?
This is inside. Yeah. So this is inside of a 4x4 tent. Yeah.
Like a hoop? Like a hoop house?
No, so this is like a actual grow tent. So it's something you buy dedicated for this. It's like a 4x4 by 7 foot little box. Yeah.
What size is a grow tent?
Yeah, so it really depends on what you're looking to do. If you have a ton of space, like the ideal goal is you have a basement dedicated just to growing. You have like 4 5x5 tents. That's, if you can do that, highly recommend. But like I personally go with a 4x4 in my apartment. I live in an apartment that doesn't have a ton amount of space. That at least gives me enough to work with without having to worry about sort of it being too tiny small. Could you do like a 2x2 tent? Absolutely. It's just going to limit how many plants you're allowed to have. Yeah.
Is there like a general square footage per plant that you're looking for?
So we're going to talk a little bit about that during that vegetative section because yeah, there is something that we'd recommend. It actually is dependent upon the pot size that it's in. Yeah. You can install like a reverse osmosis filter. It filters all of your water that comes in. That's the ideal. It's really not too expensive of a setup. You're looking at like $200 to $300 to get that installed in your home. That's the ideal. I mentioned I live in an apartment. They said no to me installing a reverse osmosis filter. I don't know why. And so distilled water is really that best way to go. Now, distilled water, I want to touch this because it's not an environmentally friendly method of water. Generally speaking, for every gallon of water you're buying, there's about 1.5 gallons that went just into the production of that. So it's really not like the most environmentally sustainable method. But for a home grower, if you're growing just a small number of plants, you're going to be going through a pretty limited amount of water. If you are ever thinking of growing on a commercial scale, please do not buy distilled water from Cub. Do not do that. Yeah. But if you're getting like tap water, I'd really recommend looking at that report first, just because it could have some things in there that could lead to some issues. Yeah. So water. Again, I wish I had a better answer for you. I personally, generally speaking, get distilled water. You can try to find it in 5-gallon jugs, but generally it's 1-gallon jugs from Cub, and it's not ideal. Yeah.
So what's the average pH of distilled water?
The average pH, generally it's right at 7.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. Which makes it super easy for treating. Is like I can go to Cub, buy 1 gallon, and know it's exactly 3 drops of pH down to get it to where I want it to, which is an advantage. It's a bummer, though, having to buy so much plastic. Yeah. All right, so let's move on from this because it's just such a bummer. So you mentioned the pH of water, and that's actually super important and transitions really nicely. So your plant needs to absorb a wide variety of nutrients, and we'll talk about what they are in a couple of minutes. But the pH of your water, how acidic or basic it is, will determine how well your plant is able to actually absorb those nutrients. So you can see if you have water that's super acidic, your plant is just locked out from a lot of that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that it needs. Similarly, if it's super duper basic, it's locked out from other types of nutrients. Your plant needs to be sort of right in that middle, right sort of around this like 5.7 to 6.1 range. Obviously, you can have some variation in there, but right around there is sort of the ideal for growing cannabis. That's why making sure that you're able to manage your water matters. We're going to talk about a tool that's called a pH meter. This is a pH meter I use at home. It's just like a really simple like measuring tool, but it will help you to know exactly what that pH of the water is, which is really important. Okay.
Would you like some water?
Would you like some water? I suppose. That's a good transition. Thank you, I appreciate it. This is my water management system, is Steven.
Would anyone else like some water? Yeah?
So now we're going to talk a little bit about nutrients. And I apologize that I'm going quickly. You all will get access to these slides. We'll be emailing them out to you in just the next couple of days, likely by this evening, but if not, by tomorrow morning. So you'll be able to come back and check out all of this. Dr. Clement Dabney taught us the important lesson of check to make sure that you're capturing it in like a clean, safe environment. He was giving water to a plant and couldn't figure out why it wasn't. And then we opened up the reservoir. There's a bunch of shit growing in it, and that's not good. So yeah, but absolutely. It's a great way around that too. There's so much that you can do if you have a home that you can't do if you have an apartment that really, really makes growing a lot easier. Collecting rainwater is one of those great examples. Also, your own compost is another cool one. So we're going to talk about nutrients a little bit. We're going to sort of talk about them briefly because I want to provide you that base knowledge to figure out what nutrients your plants needs, but what specific nutrient blend you use, how specific you apply those nutrients, sort of depends on your specific method that you want to go for. So cannabis uses nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are 3 of the big ones, but it's not the only nutrients that cannabis uses. And you can provide them in a wide variety of different ways. These are 3 really common ways that people provide those nutrients. One is just like a liquid nutrient. I brought some here. It's very basic. It's just the nutrients that your plant needs in concentrate form. You mix it into water and you give that to your plant. This is a 1-part nutrient, so you're literally just mixing this into water and giving it to your plant. This is a pretty well-known one, but really like the most commonly known one is this Fox Farm one. This is a 3-part. Unless you look on their website, then it tells you it's like a 17-part, but you do not need all that. But it's like a 3-part step that you provide these 2 during that growing vegetative part. You switch it up slightly during flowering because it needs to change slightly, but otherwise you're just mixing it into your water. It's super easy. It is what we recommend for beginners. While there are other things that you can use, obviously there's 2 more on the screen I'm going to talk about. This is really that one that if you're just getting started, we recommend sticking with. The reason is you're just able to vary how much nutrients you're providing very quickly to your plant. If you're noticing a problem, you can sort of adjust it within just a day or two. With dry nutrients and super soil, it becomes a bit more challenging. Is it still possible? Absolutely. It's a bit harder as a beginner compared to those liquid nutrients. Dry nutrients are exactly what they sound like. It's not liquid, it's dry. You're mixing it into the soil. You can do something known as top feeding, which is where you're literally just sort of like massaging it into the top part of the soil. As you water, those nutrients flow down to the roots. You're doing that not every time you water, not even every week, not even every other week. Oftentimes you're doing it just a couple times during that growing. It can be great because you really only need to do it a few times. You don't have to worry like, oh shit, I forgot to feed the plants again. You really just have to do it a few times. But as I said, it can be a little bit harder to modulate. So if you're noticing problems, you're likely having to rely on some sort of liquid nutrient to help you balance that out, generally speaking. And then finally, super soil. This is something that's become a lot more popular over the last couple of years, especially for new beginners, because it provides all the nutrients that you need just in the soil itself. We actually did a super soil class about a month ago. We're hoping to do another one in a couple of months where people can build their own super soil. In essence, it's just a really, really nutrient-packed soil blend that your plant seeps from throughout its growing stage. Build a Soil 3.0 is like the most commonly commercially available one. They'll tell you you can get all the way through a plant only giving it water. I've not personally tried that. I'm a bit skeptical, but it's really well known in the industry. I'd highly recommend if you're looking for something where you're just providing that pH balanced water, super soil is a great way to go for that. And then finally, seeds and clones. Now, Bob and Aaron out there are really the people to talk to if you want to get some seeds. I actually just bought some seeds from them the other day. I'm very stoked to grow those. But I wanted to talk about some of the seeds you might find over there because it will really determine how you're growing your plants. Regular seeds are like the seeds you find out in nature. Think of like those Punnett squares in high school biology. Like it's two plants coming together and it produces either male or female plants. Now you might be looking to grow male plants. I would really challenge you to not do that. And the reason is that female plants are the ones that produce that flower that creates those trichomes. When they are producing seed, which happens when they're around male plants, it really lowers the amount of terpenes and cannabinoids that plant is actually growing. Putting so much energy towards growing those seeds, less towards growing those terpenes, those trichomes, those cannabinoids. So we recommend going with something known as feminized. Now, feminized seeds are created in a couple different ways, but in essence, it's using female pollen to germinate a female plant. So it only contains female DNA, meaning that the seeds are only going to produce female plants. It's the only genetics that they have in them. Now, there are things that can go wrong during your growth, so it's still important to know how to sex your plant. But in general, we recommend sticking with those feminized plants because you don't have to worry about getting 3 months into your grow, switching to flowering, noticing they're all male plants and having to kill everything. It's a bummer. I've definitely been there before of having a plant that you think is like, wow, this one's getting really tall. I'm super excited about this one. And then you realize later the reason it's getting so tall is because it's a male plant. Not what you want to have happening. So we recommend sticking with feminized seeds. I also mentioned that cannabis moved through its life cycle based on how much light it has. Because they're photosensitive. Autoflowers have bred that out. So they're, in essence, going to move into that flowering part of their life much quicker. They're generally going to grow from start to finish a lot faster than photoperiods. But they also, generally speaking, are smaller plants with lower yield. So you're sort of having that trade-off. What's nice about autoflowers is you do not have to worry about the light schedule at all. If I was giving a plant to my mom to grow, and honestly, it would probably be an autoflower because then I don't have to have her finicking with lights. It's just, hey, grow this. If you have light leaks, it doesn't matter. So that's what autoflower is. Dispensary and the bud tender might say, hey, do you want indica or sativa? I hate that. But really, that's not how you should be purchasing seeds. Indica and sativa, from a scientific standpoint, are not genetically different. We can have plants that exhibit like traditional sativa traits along with traditional indica traits. Really, it's a lot more about this full spectrum of a terpene profile that it creates. Are there plants that are perhaps a little bit, in terms of effect, leading more towards like an indica classic effect, sure. It really is so varied and so murky nowadays. The idea of saying like, oh, this plant is 30% sativa and 70% indica it's all made up. It's essentially just like a way to advertise and sell things. Does it have its role? For sure. When my parents walk into a dispensary, they want to just say like, yeah, I want an indica, and that's great for them. You're a home grower now. You get to have so much more control over what it is you're producing. Really, I would challenge you to think so much more beyond like, is this indica or sativa? Because while that will tell you some things, thinking about these 5 things will tell you so much more about how that plant is going to finish out. So think about how large of a space you have. Some plants are just known for being traditionally larger. Are there ways you can grow them smaller? For sure. But if you're growing a plant that's like known for being best grown outdoors, and you're trying to fit it inside of your grow tent, you might run into some issues. We can, of course, guide nature, but we're not in control of nature. So think about how much space you have. If you're growing outdoors, find a cool large plant. I would highly recommend that. If you're growing indoors, think about your space. Also think about your maturation speed. And these two really go hand in hand, that speed and that yield. The longer your plant is going to grow, generally speaking, the more it's going to grow. And similarly, if you have a plant that's finishing a lot quicker, it has just less time to grow. It's going to have less overall product. Generally speaking, of course, can you get fast plants that have high yields? For sure. But generally speaking, think of those as like inverse. If you got more yield, you're getting longer time. If you got shorter time, you're getting lower yields. Yeah.
What size pot would you recommend?
Oh, such a great question. So we're actually going to talk about that in just a couple minutes with arrangement. So I'm going to come back to that one. But yeah, really great question. Think about that flavor, aroma, and then I put effect on here, but I really, really, really want you to have a big grain of salt with that. We're so early on in researching terpene profiles and their effects on people. The idea of being able to say that like, oh, this is, Max Stomper, and that's just, it's going to make you energetic. It is what it is. That's pseudoscience, unfortunately. I would love that, but we're not there yet. So think more about like what kind of flavor or aroma you want. Growing a cultivar that's just more traditionally known for being like a tangy strain is going to have more of that type of scent. I just finished growing garlic butter by Humboldt Seed Co. And it really is like a musky, like earthy smell to it, and it's fascinating. And you get so much closer between when that plant is harvested and when you're actually using it. You get so much more of that flavor than maybe the product you've been buying from people for years. Not trying to badmouth that, it's important, but also if you're harvesting and then just a couple weeks later smoking that, it's going to be so much more flavorful. Yeah. Grower, but there are cultivars that are just a bit known for being bug sucks or alternatively more bug resistant. GG4 is like a really well-known strain that's just a bit more known for being attractors of bugs. It is what it is. It's not a bad plant. It's just something you need to know before you go in. By thinking of these things when you're preparing to figure out what it is you want to go, so like when you go over to Bob and Aaron a little bit later, think about these types of things, because it will help you just to be a better informed consumer. Of course, can you change things about your plant later? Can you try to grow it in a method that hints it in one direction? For sure. But don't fight the genetics. Get genetics to help you along the way. And then when you're starting seeds, if you've looked online, you've probably seen like a paper towel method. You might have even done it yourself. I'm not going to badmouth it. But I am going to say we don't recommend it because there's just so many things that can go wrong between starting that seed, transferring it to the soil. We really recommend just putting seed directly into soil. This is a photo that I took of my own seed when I was starting it. This is when it's just starting to pop out. It's in a little tiny plant or a planter that's about like 2 inches by 2 inches. It has a little humidity dome you can pop on top. This is just going to be the way to go. As that seed emerges with that taproot, it really helps it to orient itself, really helps it to figure out how it's going to grow. If you're moving it from paper towel into soil, you're sort of fighting some of those natural methods. We recommend just putting it in soil. It doesn't need to be complicated, just grow the seed. Yeah.
How long does it need the heat mat?
Great question. We recommend until it starts emerging. Generally speaking, you're looking at like 2 to 7 days. I do personally at home like to give it that heat mat for a little bit longer. So I'll go like a couple of weeks out just to help it continue to grow. But that's not really based on science. In essence, as long as it's warm during that germination when it's popping, you're pretty good to go. Yeah.
The paper towel method, at least, like I've seen people put their seeds into like a container.
And you're here. The vegetative stage is one of the most important parts of growing cannabis. Flowering is also one of the most important parts of growing cannabis, but I want to first talk about vegetative. This is really where you're laying that groundwork to figure out what is your plant going to grow. The big word that I like to emphasize is infrastructure. You're growing branches and leaves and nodes not just because they're cool, but because they're eventually going to grow to flowering. And all that you're trying to do during this vegetative part of the life cycle is get your plant to that ideal state for it to start flowering. Now, of course, if you're using an autoflower, there's a little bit less that you're doing to move that plant through. But if you're having a photosensitive plant, the vegetative part of the life cycle is really when you get to hone in and figure out, how do I want to grow this cannabis? And that's where we're going to talk about the pot size in a second. Your plant's growing new nodes. Those are really important. We're going to talk about what they are in a minute, but essentially it's where it's growing those auxiliary bud sites and new leaves. Photosensitive plants can be kept in this part of its life cycle technically indefinitely, especially by a master grower, as long as you maintain that 18 hours of light. And then nitrogen is really the name of the game during this part of its life cycle. It does need phosphorus, it does need potassium, it does need a variety of other macro and micronutrients, but in essence, if you had to focus on one main thing during this part, make sure you're providing a high amount of nitrogen. So we're going to talk about light, arrangement, and pruning methods. Because those are really the big things that you need to be focusing on during the vegetative part of life. And light is going to be a really quick one. Now, you want to be providing 2 different amounts of light. One amount of light is the number of hours. This is really the most important because this is what's determining when your plant is moving on to flowering. As long as you're maintaining 18 hours of light, in some cultivars as low as 16 hours of light, you're keeping it within that vegetative part of its life cycle. But the other thing to be looking at is the amount, not the hours, but actually like the intensity of the light that you're providing. Now, if we were growing, a decade ago, I'd have to sort of give you some rough guidelines on like have your light about this distance. We don't really have to do that anymore. We all have smartphones in our pockets. I'm sure grow teachers a decade ago were saying like, you won't walk around with a photon meter everywhere, but we do, And it's the app called Photon, and there's many other similar ones. But in essence, you just put this where your leaves are. It uses the camera on your light, or on your phone, to figure out how much intensity your light is getting. This is so helpful because you want your plant to be receiving about this amount of light. You can vary that, of course, but this is like the rough guidelines, and you can check that just by opening up your phone. It's really like the simplest app out there. I use it way too often, and it just is constantly measuring how much light you're receiving. As you get it closer to light, it's going to start going up because the amount of light that it's receiving is going up. It's a really handy tool, so we recommend using that. That's all I'm going to talk about light because figure it out. No, I'm just kidding, but because there's really not much more to it. And now let's talk about arrangement, because this is the thing that really is determinant of how large your plants are going to get and how you want to grow them. Well, of course, you can put a seed into soil and allow the plant to just sort of work its way through the end. There's a lot that we can be doing in terms of arranging, pruning, and training our plant to get it to look how we want it to. So there was a question earlier about like pot size, and it really determines about how you're wanting to grow. And before anyone says anything, I already have that disclaimer on here. You have to follow local regulations. I'm not telling you to break the law. But if you're looking to grow inside of a 4x4 tent, this is generally what you'd look at doing. Maybe you want to only have one plant. You want to be able to try to merge it or try to get it to the shape exactly that you want it to. We'll talk about some methods in a couple of minutes. You'd be growing in a pretty large pot, in upwards like 50-gallon buckets you're putting inside of that grow tent. Now that is going to be a monster plant. What we like to sort of tell people as they're thinking about this is that whatever is happening above soil is mirrored below soil. So if you have a ton of room for your roots to grow out, you are also going to have branches that grow like crazy. If you keep your plants in a 1-gallon pot, you can get them to the end. They're not going to grow as large if you had them in something a little bit larger. So this is sort of that spectrum. Of course, it varies if you're looking at like a 3x3 tent or a 5x5 or however you're looking to grow. But generally recommend sticking with a 5 to 15-gallon bucket and around that 4 plants. Can you do 1 per tent? Absolutely. If you have 4 grow tents in your basement, do 1 per tent and I'll come over every day. But you also can have a bunch of plants. And again, you might be in a place somewhere where you can legally grow 16 plants. Or maybe you only have a 2x2 and you're growing 4 plants packed in there. This method of arrangement and pot size is really how you're going to determine how that plant's going to look at the end. But there are other things that go into it as well, and we'll talk about those here. So you might have heard of something called topping. Topping is a super duper awesome and helpful cannabis tool that allows you to help to shift where that dominance is on your plant. Now, cannabis, generally speaking, wants to keep growing upwards. It has a main stem. It wants to keep growing tall. If you look at cannabis that was grown in Minnesota in like the early 1900s, it is like 12, 14 feet tall. It is still cannabis. It's just cannabis that was primarily focused on that main central stem, and also was grown for fiber and a number of other things. But in essence, by topping, by actually removing that top part of the stem, and this is a lot blurrier than I thought it would be, so I apologize, but you're forcing that plant to put much more energy towards putting off 2 shoots. And instead of having 1 main stem, you're going to have that energy split between 2. And you can technically top again and have 4 main stalks that your plant is growing. This can be really helpful if you're trying to arrange your plant in a specific way. So like, let's say you have, your 1 plant in a 50-gallon bucket. You don't want it just to grow all the way up. You want it to grow outward. And by topping, you're going to be forcing a lot of that energy towards those lower nodes. You can also do something called defoliating. In fact, I heavily, heavily encourage you to do something called defoliating. It's where you're going to remove a lot of those lower fan leaves that are not receiving light. And also some unhealthy leaves, but we recommend sticking those. So here's a nice visual. You can see on the left side there's a plant. It's looking really sad because the lower sites don't get any light and it's not getting any breeze. But now we trimmed off some of its leaves. Now that lower light, or the light is able to reach those lower branches. It has good airflow. It's a much happier cannabis plant. Now I know after you defoliate, you look in your tent and you go, oh my God, what have I done? But really, it's a plant that's going to keep growing. It wants to keep putting energy towards growing. By you sort of trimming it back a little bit, you're just helping it to direct the energy towards what you want. So topping and defoliating. But both of those can sort of come together into a school of thought around arrangement. It's not just making sure I'm trimming off the leaves. It's not just making sure that I'm topping the plant, but it's something that's entirely different. And the first one that we're going to talk about is sea of green. Now this is an old school growing method. People that were growing indoors back in like the 1970s, some of the earliest people to start looking at growing cannabis indoors in the United States, they were going with something called a sea of green. In essence, they were taking their grow area and fitting as many plants as they possibly could into that area. You're getting a sea of green. It looks like you have just plants all over the place. The reason for doing this was sort of twofold. One, you want to fit as many plants into there as possible, hoping to maximize your yields. But the other thing is with the sea of green method, you don't need the plant to grow as large to get the yield that you're looking for. In fact, it's not going to grow as large. It's in a tiny pot. But because you have, not just 1 plant, but 16 plants, not legally, but 4 plants in there, you get this like sea of green effect. And your plants are able to reach that end of its life a lot quicker just because they don't need to grow as large. Now, of course, those plants do have lower yields, but because you have a sea of green, you have many different plants, it sort of helps to account for that. So you can see that's what it looks like in veg, that's what it looks like in flower. It looks very, very impressive, for sure. You do notice that the plants that you're growing have slightly lower yields. You don't need to top with this method, but it does really impact your arrangement. If you're doing sea of green, you're packing those plants in really close. And then one that's really taken over the home grow industry the last couple of years is this one. It's called the screen of green. I hate that they're so similar. But screen of green is slightly different in that you're not trying to arrange your plants as close together, but it's more about using a vertical growing method to try to stretch out how that plant is growing. This is what that looks like. So you can see it's one plant that has a trellis that's forcing it in all different directions, and you're having one plant that creates sort of a visual effect that looks a bit like the sea of green. Now that's just one plant. You're not having 16 in there. And if you're looking to try to increase your maximum yield per plant, screen of green is going to be the way to do it. You're going to be able to maximize it that way. And you're just going to be able to grow less plants, but still get that higher yield. And then I want to talk a bit about identifying problems, and then we're going to move on to the most flashiest part of growing, which is flowering. And then really we're coming into the end of it. So identifying problems is something that's really important for home growers to be able to do. When we sort of set out to build this course a couple of years ago, one of the things that we wanted to do was create like this awesome tool that people could use, and it would identify all of their problems for them. And really, that's just not how cannabis works. Cannabis does have signs to tell you about things that are going on. It changes its leaf color, it changes its leaf shape, it orients ways in which that it's growing. But it's sort of a communication. It's a two-way road of you need to figure out more things about that plant to be able to really identify problems in the best possible method. So you start by looking at leaves. Oftentimes this is really how people notice they have problems, because they notice browning around their leaves. They notice curling. You've probably seen this visual before. It's super popular online. And we just wanted to throw it in here because it's really a great guide to show you that early stage, that progressing stage, and that late stage of some of these deficiencies. These are some of the most common deficiencies you'll run into, and things that you'll need to figure out. So while there's not like a tool that you can sit down with, this isn't exactly like an end-all, be-all, it can sort of point you in the right direction, but it's not where the conversation stops. You can also be checking a lot of other different things. This comes from that Cannabis Grower's Handbook. I know they're selling it in the Speakeasy Lounge, but also we'll be emailing this page out to you all as well, because it can really be helpful in helping to figure out some of those deficiencies. But you can see on here, there's so much more than just the color of the leaf. You also have the change in how the leaf is growing, whether it's stunted, you've got pale coloring, you've got molting, spindling. Your plant is going to do a lot. It's how it communicates with you. And it's really about figuring out how to best read that and try things out. You know, check the pH of your soil. See how that's growing. If it's really out of balance, well, that's something for you to address. If you notice, hey, I haven't given my, I mean this as lovingly as possible. We had someone on Twitter that sent us a message of their plant and says, it's looking really sad. Like, what do I do? And we asked, like, well, what nutrients have you been providing? I said, oh, I haven't been doing that. Oh, well, that could hint at it. If you've been growing this plant all season, it's in a red Solo cup, it might need some nutrients at some point. And again, I don't at all mean that disrespectfully, but like truly, we recommend you check out what your plant is trying to say. It can communicate with you in a couple different ways. Talking is not one of them though. So you gotta learn how to read the plant language. And it takes some time. You might be trying to fix like a calcium problem and then you realize, oh, I've just been underwatering this whole time. Lots of different things to try out. Yeah. Now you got to do something with it. Some quick facts, because we got to do those. There's something known as a photochrome. That's that photoreceptor inside of the cannabis plant that's measuring how much light it's receiving. When it has enough hours of darkness, they start decaying, and when enough of those decay, it begins flowering. This is why when people say, hey, you got to have your plant in 24 hours of darkness before you start flowering, we generally recommend against that because it's just, you can trick your plant a little bit. It still takes a couple days for those receptors to really fully decay. So you're not doing a huge amount of jump start from that. Another thing is that this stage can take that 6 to 11 weeks. There are some that finish quicker sometimes. I have seen some that say they take longer. I'd say 95% of the cannabis you're going to find fits in that window. And then finally, we're going to talk about what the female plant produces, which really helps us to have that, the flower. So we're going to talk about lights a little bit. The only thing I want to say is that to simulate nature, you want to reduce the amount of hours you're giving it. Some cultivars can begin flowering as soon as they get like 14 hours of light, but 12 hours is a pretty universal. You don't have to worry about anything going wrong. You know that when you have 12 hours of light, then 12 hours of complete darkness, not just like 12 hours over a 24-hour time period, you're going to have those receptors decay, and it's going to signal to the plant to begin flowering. If we think about where cannabis was grown natively in parts of the world, that as the seasons come to an end, the amount of hours just comes to an end. So this is how cannabis has naturally developed the ability to know when to start that flower production, is based on the amount of light. Talking a little bit about nutrients, it's the exact same in terms of how you're providing your nutrients to your plants. It's just a slightly different balance of nutrients. It's using way less nitrogen because it's not building new leaves for the most part. It's instead focusing on the flower, so potassium, phosphorus, and a wide variety of other macronutrients as well. So we recommend continuing using that vegetative nutrient. So if like you're using some sort of blend, keep using that until you start seeing that flowering. Otherwise, you're going to be providing a bunch of potassium and phosphorus that it's not going to need yet. As soon as you begin that flowering, though, that's when I would make that switch over. And then sexing, something that I really want to talk about because it's really important when you're growing at home. Now, when I first started growing, I remember thinking, I don't need to learn how to do this. I'm just going to grow feminized seeds. Problem solved. No, problem not solved. Well, oftentimes those feminized plants will grow out to a feminized the feminized seeds will grow out in the end to a feminized plant. There are some things that can go wrong during the grow that can lead your plant to go into shock. Light leak is a really common one that people face that can sometimes put plants into shock and cause them to start producing male hormones. So you got to be able to identify what those look like so you know how to solve that problem later on. So make sure you remain vigilant. Also, sometimes seeds are mislabeled. It's a bummer. So make sure you're remaining vigilant. You wouldn't want a plant to go on to ruin a bunch of other plants. This is sort of our visual guide. It includes both that really close-up photo here and here, and then a little bit further out photo. So this is sort of what you'd see as your plant begins to start flowering in that first week or two of flowering. And you get male and female sexual organs. It's really helpful to identify what these male ones look like because that's something you should really hunt down and try to get rid of. If you're breeding, of course, ignore me.
Oh, yeah, good question. You had mentioned light leak.
Yeah, great question. All right, so these are the things you should be looking out for. I'm not going to read off all the information about it, but in essence, it's just a visual description of what you're looking for in your plant. Be vigilant. It's about a week after flowering you'd start to see these, so make sure you're keeping your eyes peeled. And then the last thing that I want to talk about with flowering is really how to time your harvest. Now, it says on here a little bit about like euphoric versus body and head high. I want to sort of add some really big scoops of salt around that because as we talked about before, there's a ton of research into how cannabis affects you. Well, there are studies that show that as it gets more amber, you're getting higher amounts of CBN versus THC. That is factually true. To say that like amber one is always going to give you that couch lock high, I struggle to pass that on as factual information. But in essence, you're looking for this type of color on your actual plant itself. Now you are having to use some sort of like jeweler's loupe, like a microscope of some sort to be able to look at these trichome heads. If you have an iPhone and you can use the macro lens, it's a little bit tricky, but it's the nice sort of, you have it in your pocket kind of method, can help to hint you towards that. Do you have a question?
I actually came mostly to ask about trichome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like I'm on the medical program here, and I just hit. Well, it's day 50 now.
Mm-hmm.
I have an autovirus ticket, so it's already flowering, and they're getting pretty milky right now. And I'm trying to figure out when to flush and stuff. And I'm looking at like some of my medical stuff and some of the literature I'm reading, and it seems like they're prioritizing that like they're just letting it run through until their bud is at the maximum size. Everything's like pretty much orange. And a lot of them, you know, like kind of dying. And so I'm like,
Absolutely.
maybe I will harvest soon as opposed to waiting.
Absolutely.
Decide.
And that's one of the nice parts about being able to be home growers is you sort of get to decide whereabouts you want to harvest. So like another thing that I just want to throw in, one of the reasons that you might be seeing medical flower looking a lot more amber is as that flower continues to cure, sort of during that drying process, it will continue to transition a bit. But also, I imagine they're harvesting 300 plants at a time. They're not looking at the trichomes. They're sort of maybe looking at 1 or 2 and judging based off of that. Yeah.
Is that going to be
When you have that milky white, that's when you're just going to have that highest THC percentage. Sort of what we're growing for. If you're looking for CBDN, you can grow for that. But generally speaking, when you see that cloudiness, that's when you want to pull it. You are going to have that some transition during curing. So once you got pretty universally cloudy trichome heads, that's when you're going to chop your plant. Speaking of which, let's talk about chopping our plants. So I always feel like a bummer during this part of the class because we've spent so long talking about how to care for your plant, and now I'm going to tell you how to kill it. But that's sort of the reason that we're doing this. It's helping to complete that life cycle. We're guiding these plants, we're shepherding them, if you will. And while many of these things, the drying, the processing, all that stuff, sort of happens in nature, we're helping to play that role and also helping to get a great product at the end. So finish strong. It's always a bummer, but you know, you get something cool at the end. So harvesting is sort of a 3-step process for most home growers. And I'm going to talk about some situations where you wouldn't do this in a couple of minutes. But in essence, you're going to chop that plant, and depending upon your size, you're either going to chop it right at the base and hang dry it that way, or if you have a really dense plant, we recommend chopping it by the branch and hanging it that way. It really depends on how much space you have. Some methods say you should keep the branches on there. It helps the moisture to flow through the plant during that drying part. I would say it's probably a nominal difference for a home grower. Do what works best for your space. You can hang dry it actually inside of your grow tent. It might require a little bit control around the humidity, but in essence, you can use that exact same space that's already having a carbon filter applied to the air to help to dry your bud as well. You want to keep it for about a week in that 50 to 60 degree humidity range and temperatures around that 70 degrees. The goal is that you're gradually bringing that humidity down, not just shocking it and sucking all of that moisture out, but allowing it to just sort of gradually move into curing. If you want to learn like a lot more about curing, I'm going to plug a class we're doing next month. Boveda is actually coming to talk about how they recommend curing using a lot of their different products. So this is sort of my method that I use. Keep it inside of a jar, or if you have a lot of product, inside of like a Grove bag. Make sure that you're still checking that humidity. Make sure that you're allowing fresh air to get into it. But in essence, you're just going to sort of wean it off of being burped until you just have cannabis in a jar that's dry and ready to be smoked. It's sort of, again, on that vibes kind of thing. Yes, you can use a meter to figure out what the humidity is, but in essence of like, when is your product done? That's sort of what you get to decide. Some people really like that long cure, like an 8-week cure. If you have the patience for that, God bless you. But you also can do something as long as 2 weeks and still have a high quality product that's going to maintain that humidity level for a wide variety of time. You can then trim your cannabis. We're just going to talk a little bit about this because I wanted to point out that we generally recommend doing a lot of your trimming dry. And our reason for that is those leaves have moisture inside of it that as your plant is moving through that drying process, it's going to pull from. If you chop them all at the beginning, you're removing a lot of that moisture that your plant can tap into. Now, I really want to stress here, this is preference. This is not science. Nobody would say, hey, studies show if you chop the leaves off, you're going to have a less good product. No, this is definitely preference. You can chop everything and trim it when it's wet and dry it on like a hanging basket. That is one method. Generally speaking though, we recommend chopping off the large leaves during that wet cycle, allowing your plant to hang dry, and then doing a lot more of that finer trimming. It's just sort of that middle balance of keeping a lot of moisture in the plant, but also it's not super difficult. We're going to do some trimming classes in the future. It's really not something that's super difficult. It is something that takes a long, long time though. So you might be in trimming jail after you harvest. And then I just wanted to throw this caveat in as well. There's a lot of options on what we can be doing as home growers here in Minnesota. I had a pretty fun weekend this weekend, and that's I got to work with some people here in the state to take the home grow that I processed and to turn it into some pretty cool rosin. So it went through a bubble hash process that you're seeing here. It created this material that was then run through a rosin press, and you get something like that. It's like a dabbable concentrate.
Did you freeze dry it?
I did, yeah. And this was done entirely at home, except for the freeze dryer that I borrowed a commercial space that had one. But this is like 100% legal concentrates that we get to make here in Minnesota. I don't have enough time tonight to talk about how to actually do that, but we do have a class upcoming in December where we're going to break that down a lot. There's also a ton of information online that you can find about this. So I'm not trying to like gatekeep this. Please go look this up. It's called bubble hash. It's called rosin making. This is stuff that I now get to have at home and smoke because I grew it and then I got to process it, and at no point did I ever break a single law, at least here in Minnesota.
How much can you have?
Of concentrates?
Yeah.
8 grams of concentrates maximum. I know, it sucks. I hate that. I have no more than 8 grams at home. No more. No more. But I wanted to throw this in there because while we talk a lot about drying, we talk a lot about curing, and yes, that is important, whether you're going to use it as a smokable product or using it in edibles, there are some things you can do to skip that. So for example, with my home grow, I never dried it. I harvested it, it went directly into the freezer, it then went directly into the washing machine. We got this cool purple stuff, and then you end up with concentrate. Now it does still need to cure, but I don't ever have to dry. It's just one thing that we wanted to throw in there because you as home growers, you have options, so many options. Just think about what you want to do with that product when you actually have it. Yeah?
Is kief classified as concentrates?
Technically, but that's such a great question from a legal perspective. Wow, I don't know that one. What do you think?
I don't think it's good.
Yeah, I don't, so. And then on that, got about an 80% return after I pressed it. So it's like not a great, like I only have like a couple little jars filled with this stuff compared to having like 2 big Grove bags filled with it. But at least for me, like this is just a much more usable product. So you lose a little bit, but you gain some other stuff. Yeah.
We're working on a dabs class.
Oh yeah.
December.
Have you tried it yet?
No, so I actually just finished making it yesterday. I want to give it the full week to cure. Come back to me in a week. I'll tell you how it is. So I want to talk about some of the resources we're going to give you. It's 8:30. I gab way too long. I apologize. But only 2 minutes over. That's not too bad. All right. So recommended shopping list. This is a tool that we're going to give you all. This will be emailed out. You also can get it at this QR code right here. It talks through some of the things that we'd recommend buying. Now, we're not sponsored by any of these people. We're just recommending this because, in total honesty, this is mostly what I use in my own home grow. So you can see like how much you're looking at spending cost-wise. And it's, I think, sort of a bigger number than some people might be expecting. But the reason that we highlighted a couple items is those are some of the things that you really should be having on day one. There are some other things that you can be getting a little bit later on. So if you're wanting to start grow tomorrow, we really recommend, you need a tent of sorts, you need a light, you need soil. Do you need your trellis netting tomorrow? No, for sure not. So just some things to check out. There are also many different ways to stay connected with us. So we've got an alumni Facebook group that we're going to be emailing out to all of you. You've technically been through one of our classes. Congrats, you're an alumni of the Minnesota Cannabis College. You'll be able to join our Facebook group. We've got a bunch of passionate growers here in Minnesota that are on there. You can talk to Sean about that. He's one of the growers in there. And it sort of tells us a little bit about what people are doing. We're able to answer questions. If you have more questions after tonight, we'll be on here as well. And then also we do have that next class coming up. So in just about a month, yeah, a little less than that, we'll be getting together with Bovida right here in this exact same room, and they'll be telling you a little bit about how they would recommend going about drying and curing your cannabis at home. Bovida, it's great having them here in the state. They've been here for a while, and now they're able to actually help our cannabis industry. So we're really going to be relying on them.
And there's a community service event on Sunday. If anybody wants to come back here, we're going to clean up for an hour around the uptown area, and then we're going to come back outside. We've got a private patio. If anybody wants to smoke tonight, combustion, there's a private patio we can go out to. But we're going to be back here noon on Sunday, cleaning up uptown and then celebrating afterwards. And we'll have more 4-packs and things like that to give away. So, awesome.
And then we really just want to end with like a huge thank you to all of you. I really appreciate being able to talk to people about growing cannabis. My fiance is sick of it, so I appreciate you all letting me talk to you about it. We're here to answer any questions that we can in the ongoing future, so never hesitate to reach out. But also a big thank you to a lot of the people that helped us to make this possible tonight.